Alright, so now that you understand the argument, or at least have some good headway here on understanding the ontological argument, it's time to discuss how we might get out of it. Right, so at this point, if you don't question any of the premises, since Anselm's given us a logical argument, you should accept the conclusion. Right? So if the argument has been given to you in a logical format, and none of the premises are false, then it would be irrational for you to deny the conclusion. So we don't want to be irrational, right? But we might want to disagree with Anselm's conclusion. So how could we do that? Well, we have to question premise 1, 2, or 3. Right? So 4 is just an assumption. 5 through 9 just follow logically from what's been said before. The only places open to object to this argument are premises 1 through 3. Now, we gave some rough defenses of 1 through 3 when we did our prep work in the first 2 videos. Right? We gave some rough explanations as to why you might believe premises 1 through 3. But now is the time to go back and put some pressure on them and see if they really hold up to scrutiny. Right? So they might be intuitively plausible, but maybe they don't hold up when we put a lot of pressure there. So let's look through our options. Right? Premise 1 doesn't seem like a great jumping off point. That's a pretty simple claim, right? God exists in the understanding. If we're going to be atheists or theists, then we both seem to agree that God exists in the understanding. You might want to say something like, I can't even possibly conceive of the greatest conceivable being. Right? That's something beyond my imagination. And I guess that could be a way of getting around premise 1, but it wouldn't be extremely satisfying, right? Because then Anselm would just say, okay, well, for anybody who does have this idea of God in their understanding, then we can just prove the argument works for them. And for you weird people who don't understand or don't have God in your understanding, then sure, this argument might not apply to you. But then you shouldn't be an atheist either, right? You would just have to be agnostic. So if you take a position, theist or atheist, you have to agree with number 1. So that leaves 2 and 3. And we'll look at a couple arguments for both. Right? So the first, we'll start with premise 2 here. God might have existed in reality, or God is a possible being. I think we can put some decent pressure here. So let's see how this objection developed over time. Right? So first, we start with the Benedictine monk, Guanillo. He was a contemporary of Anselm's. He read Anselm's work and then wrote him a letter bringing up this objection. So essentially, Guanillo said, I'm not sure what's wrong with your argument, Anselm, but I guarantee there is something wrong with it. There's something up with the reasoning. Because essentially, we could go back and plug in any perfect object and prove that that exists. So Guanillo famously used the example of the perfect island. So he said, hey, if the reasoning in your argument, the ontological argument, is solid, well then I would be able to prove the existence of the perfect island. But we know the perfect island doesn't exist. Therefore, there must be something wrong with the reasoning in your argument. So just to see what Guanillo's saying here, go back to the argument, and now replace every instance of God with the perfect island. So we'd have to say, the perfect island exists in the understanding. The perfect island is a possible being. But then if you assume the perfect island exists only in the understanding, well then we could think of a greater island, right? We could think of an island that's not only in our understanding, but also exists in reality. So the island, so we have to go down here, the island than which none greater is possible is an island than which a greater is possible. So therefore it's false that the perfect island exists only in the understanding. Thus, the perfect island exists in reality as well as the understanding. So hopefully you can see, once we get into this realm of perfection, since we've already claimed that existence is a perfection, any island that we think doesn't exist would be imperfect, right? We could have a better island if it also existed in reality. So this argument can be used to prove the existence of all types of things, right? Not just the perfect island, the perfect shoe, the perfect hamburger, so on and so forth. You could prove the existence of thousands of perfect things. Now, the important point is, remember, we know these things don't exist, right? So the reasoning must be bad. Okay, so that's his general objection. I don't know what's wrong specifically, but I know there's got to be an error somewhere. And if that's the case, then we shouldn't follow you through to your conclusion that God exists in reality. And since these two were contemporaries, we're lucky enough to have Anselm's actual response to Guanillo. Unfortunately, it's not very illuminating. So here's essentially what we get from Anselm. But you're wrong, and I hate you. And that's honestly paraphrasing a little bit, obviously, but that's what he said. Anselm responded to Guanillo and just said, no, it doesn't. My argument doesn't work if you put the perfect island in, and that's it. He didn't explain why he thought that. And so we know there's something wrong with the reasoning if we can use the perfect island, but Anselm just denies that we can use the perfect island. Take a minute to yourself. Why might he deny that? Right? Why does the argument work when we put in the greatest conceivable being, but doesn't work when we put in the greatest conceivable island? Okay, hopefully you thought about that for a bit. If not, please pause now and think about that. Why wouldn't the argument work if we use the island? Because Anselm doesn't even give Guanillo the time of day, roughly. He just says, no, that's wrong. It would never work that way. No detailed response. So let's go back and look. Why wouldn't this work with the perfect island? So we have to try and fill in Anselm's reasoning for him since he didn't give it to us directly. And it seems like the best bet is that Anselm thought you couldn't plug in the perfect island here into premise 2. So essentially what Anselm would be saying is the perfect island is not a possible being. Right? He'd say God, or the greatest conceivable being, is a possible being, but the greatest conceivable island is not a possible being. Why might we think that? Well, number one, it seems like the greatest conceivable island would be subjective from person to person. And so I particularly like the cold weather, not a big fan of the hot. So I would prefer my island to always be around 56 degrees. But I'm sure many of you would find that far too cold. Maybe some of you would want it in the 70s or the 80s, so on and so forth, right? And then how many coconut trees do we have to have on the perfect island? I might not care about that at all. You might think we need at least 4 or 5 trees so that I never run out of coconuts. Right, and so on and so forth. What square footage must the island have? That's going to differ from person to person. So on and so forth. Right? But none of that seems to be the case when we're talking about God. When we talk about the greatest conceivable being, we just think, okay, well, he has to be powerful, but he can't just be sort of powerful. He has to be as powerful as possible. Right? He can't just be smart. He can't just have a lot of knowledge. He has to have perfect knowledge. So essentially, there's a cap, right, to all of God's. It's weird to say a cap because we don't want to say God's limited. So take this with a grain of salt. But roughly the idea is that God has all of these qualities, and we just take them to the maximum. Right? There's no room for subjective interpretation. So God is a possible being, and we can imagine what the limits, or at least the infinitude of those powers is like. Whereas with the perfect island, that seems like it's not only going to differ from person to person, but there is no limit, right? So how many coconuts does the perfect island have to have? 99. Well, why not 100? Why not 1,000? Why not 1,000,001? Why not 1,000,002? So on and so forth. There's no limit to where that can go. But when we talk about God as the greatest conceivable being, we know exactly that that means he has to have the most power possible. Right? Okay, so I think, to sort of recap, Guanillo says there must be something wrong with your reasoning, because we could prove the existence of the perfect island or any other perfect object. And Anselm's response is to say, no, because when we go back to the argument, you can't plug in the perfect island in premise 2. But it does work still with God. So how might we respond at this point? Well, we should really ask ourselves, does the argument work with God in premise 2? Is God, as defined as the greatest conceivable being, really a possible being? So think about the two following ways of conceiving of God. Right? So think of two objects. One is the integer than which none larger is possible. The second is the angle than which none greater is possible. And so when we're talking about the integer, hopefully you see that's just not a possible thing, right? The integer than which none larger is possible cannot exist, because any number you pick, there will always be one greater. So the integer than which none larger is possible is actually not a possible object. Now think of the angle than which none greater is possible. Here it's pretty clear that that's a possible object. Here we can see that the angle than which none greater is possible is just 180 degrees. So you can look that up. An interior angle has to end at 180 degrees, otherwise you run into other issues. So the angle in which none greater is possible, 180 degrees, is clearly a possible object. So now we should ask, when we're thinking about God as the greatest conceivable being, is he more like the integer or more like the angle? Are his properties really infinite, or is there some limit to power, knowledge, and goodness? So if we think there's no limit, right, if his properties are really infinite, then it seems like he might be more like the integer, right? So in the same way as you can pick any number, right, say 10 billion, 10 trillion, so on and so forth, the biggest number you can think of off the top of your head, we can always just count one higher, right? So if God's powers are like that, then he's really more like the integer. If he's in terms of infinite power, for instance, we can always think, well, why not just a little bit more powerful than that? Why not just a little bit more powerful than that? And so on for infinity. And so maybe if we think of God's powers like that, then he's more like the integer. Now you might think that there is a limit to God's power, knowledge, and goodness, but it's not in any way limiting his greatness, right? Because his power, knowledge, and goodness are just at the highest possible level imaginable. In this case, God's powers would be much more like the angle. So we can say God is the most powerful, right? And there's no sense in which we can ask, well, what if we added a little bit more power on top of that? No, that doesn't make sense if we're conceiving of God's powers this way. There's just a cap there, and God's reached the cap, and he's the only one who's reached the cap on all of these qualities. So depending on how you think about it, God is more like the integer or the angle. So many people want to say that his properties are infinite, but that would make him more like the integer, in which case premise 2 of the ontological argument doesn't work out, because in the same way that the integer is not a possible being, God would not be a possible being, and so premise 2 would be false under this type of argument. Okay, so just to summarize, we have Guanillo's objection, which points out that there must be a problem with the argument, and only because Anselm denies that so outright do we need to look any deeper. And it turns out when we do start to look a little deeper, premise 2 might not actually be true. Now that'll depend on how we conceive of God's powers, right? Whether they're infinite or they have some type of cap. But if we can prove that God is more like the integer, then he wouldn't be a possible being, and premise 2 would be false. So then we get out of it, right? And we don't have to believe the conclusion in number 9. And we've avoided Anselm's ontological conclusion. So in the next video, we'll look at one more objection to the ontological argument, and then we'll be done for the week. Thanks, everyone.